Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview, where we're joined every week with an analyst or specialist in his or her field to look at the outlook ahead for energy security, for geopolitical nuances that are impacting this region and Asia, and how that might also all be rippling through and affecting the energy markets in turn. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Hasan, who is Research Fellow for Middle East Policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Hasan.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, great to have you and great to get your insights today. There's a lot going on in the region, a lot of moving parts, moving goalposts. So we'd love to get your views on that, and certainly, you know, a lot of confusion, I think, on where the future direction for the region, for the Middle East, is going, given the change in dynamics and geopolitical relations, stretching from the US to Asia and to China. We find ourselves here in the Middle East, right in the middle of that. Let's start by talking about, you know, what's been in the news just this week, which is a little bit of a resurgence of commentary from Iran on its nuclear negotiations, on its talks with the US, whether it's through proxies in Europe or directly or behind the scenes, and various other parties getting involved in that perhaps. Would you say that this sort of handshake that we saw last month between the two countries, and now the comments by Iran this week by Khamenei on, well, you know, anything's possible, is that a rapprochement or a détente? Where do you see this going?
Thank you very much. And I think this is it's a great starting point, because Iran is central to many of the geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East. I think the way I tend to characterize Iran's relations, both with the West and with its own neighborhood, so Saudi Arabia primarily, but some of the other Gulf states as well, is somewhat of a pendulum dynamic, essentially, where we've seen Iran de-escalate relations within its own neighborhood when its relations with the West are not going very well, and vice versa, right? So in a sense, Iran hedges against isolation from the West by engaging and reprioritizing its own neighborhood. So this was the case under former President Ahmadinejad, whose relations with the West were obviously in a terrible state, but who prioritized regional engagement and regional de-escalation. I don't know if you recall, but he was the guest of honor at one of the GCC summits in Doha and at the OIC summit in Saudi Arabia. And we see a similar dynamic with President Raisi, who on the one hand has essentially refused to budge on the nuclear file up until now, therefore thereby leading to tensions in Iran's relations with the West, but has come into government pledging to prioritize engagement with the neighborhood. And we saw the opposite dynamic with President Rouhani, who engaged very seriously with the West, concluded the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but completely neglected Iran's neighborhood. So there is, in a sense, a tension between how Iran manages its relations with the West and its relations within its own neighborhood. So we need to be cognizant of this dynamic in the way Iran manages its foreign relations. We have seen a regional de-escalation, and that hasn't just been around Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also within the GCC, right? With the Al-Ula summit, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE repairing their relations. We've seen it with Turkey as well, and we've seen it with Iran. And so this is a broader regional trend that follows the economic exhaustion of COVID-19, a lot of uncertainty about the future of the US role, a lot of ambitious economic strategies by the Gulf states and so on. So there really is a drive towards regional de-escalation. We're now seeing Iran, particularly Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, make what appears to be a set of potentially conciliatory rhetorical gestures by indicating that Iran might be willing to engage in less for less nuclear diplomacy once again with the United States, but you know, we'll wait to see.
Okay, well, I mean, that's thank you for setting the scene there, absolutely. And let's then look at it from the Saudi perspective as well, because of course we've seen Saudi Arabia taking on increasingly in the last year or two again, as the world emerges from COVID, a much more sort of independent, self sort of awareness of what it wants for its region, but for itself, primarily economically, as you said, a big economic agendas, particularly in Saudi Arabia. And of course, we've seen, at least outwardly, a different attitude towards America, towards the US by Saudi. How significant a change do you think this is from the previous relationship, a status quo of Saudi-US, in that it was US really calling the shots before, and now it seems to be the other way around?
It's clear that the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular have taken a decision to diversify away from what they view as an overdependence or an excessive reliance on the United States. So strategic diversification, I think, has become a key central theme of Emirati and Saudi foreign policy. And this is driven partly by security considerations. So in a sense, the 2019 Iranian attacks on Saudi Aramco were seen as really pushing the US GCC security partnership to its limit, where really it demonstrated the limits of the so-called US security guarantee and what the US was willing and not willing to do in order to protect its Gulf partners. And also because I think there is a broader perception that the US has deprioritized the Middle East. It's now ended the global war on terror, withdrew from Iraq and Afghanistan, and is instead focused on countering China in the Indo-Pacific and Russia in Eurasia and East Europe. And I think, so on the security side, this has meant that the Gulf states can't really rely on the US to contain and deter Iran in the same way that they could in the past. And on the geoeconomic side of things, I think the Gulf states have been very worried about what they view as the US's unprecedented weaponization of international trade and finance, especially in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think they see the US's excessive recourse to export controls, financial sanctions, setting oil price caps in the oil markets as setting a set of very dangerous precedents that really could upend the international sort of liberal economic order. So all of that, I think, has accelerated the Gulf states' desire to diversify away from an excessive dependence on the US, which takes the form of creating a broader range of strategic partnerships, including, but not limited to, China, also India, South Korea, Japan, including the EU as well. And so really a broader set of relationships that the GCC states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE especially, can rely on for various economic, security, military reasons and purposes and so on.
And quite a balancing act they're having to do, aren't they? If you let's narrow it down to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because they, as you said, they've got their relationship with China, which is obviously very linked to their energy exports to that region, and China is in turn dependent on those, despite the fact that it's taking more Russian crude at the moment because of discounts, etc. And at the same time, you have the China-US dynamic, of course, which is not too friendly these days. And then you have the Russian problem in the middle, and you've got Russia with an OPEC plus, etc. So they're trying to balance a lot of different sort of conflicting, I suppose, partnerships, and with very little experience in that field until now. Do you think there's any? What are the main sort of challenges for a kingdom like Saudi Arabia to be able to do that? If it's got economic, financial power, can it manage to do anything at once? Or where do you think it'll prioritize its relationship going forward? Will it be with Russia because of the OPEC plus agreement, or will it be with China because it's made, obviously a demand center for its energy? What do you think is behind the thinking there today?
You're absolutely right in the sense that this is a very dynamic geostrategic landscape that the Gulf states are having to manage. I think one of the clear themes, again, in their foreign policy is to avoid making hard choices and hard alignments, and really to maintain a large margin of maneuver in the way that they manage what are very often conflicting and contradictory relationships with partners that are increasingly at loggerheads and that are increasingly engaged in strategic competition with one another. You mentioned the US, China, and Russia for sure, and of course other regional powers like Iran and Turkey on the one hand, or Pakistan and India, and again, and China coming into the picture there, and so on. I think, in a sense, the Gulf states are torn primarily between their main security and defense partner, which remains the United States. And the US still has 35,000 troops stationed within the different GCC states. It is still the primary and main source of arms and weapons imports for the Gulf states. It's still the main defense and security partner. But China is obviously their main economic and trading partner. And it's also a state that is interested in, and clearly already expanding the scope of its diplomatic engagement in the Middle East. And we've seen they're facilitating the Saudi-Iran diplomatic agreement. The point is, I think the challenge for the Gulf states and for Saudi and Emirati policymakers really is active sort of portfolio management, to borrow a financial term, in the sense that this is a highly dynamic geostrategic situation. There are dependencies that cut in multiple directions. I think the main strategy for the Gulf states is to hedge and diversify in order to manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk, in the sense that avoiding overdependence or over-reliance on any given party, and really ensuring that all of these trying to manage the tensions and contradictions of the relationship. And so we've seen, for example, the US-Saudi summit with Secretary Blinken in Saudi Arabia a few days ago. And then, not 2 days later, the Saudis played host to a China-Arab summit, where they again talked about China-Arab relations. So I think for the Saudis, they are opposed to a zero-sum thinking, where a strong partnership with the US implies that they have to align against China and so on. I think they will try and protect their margin of maneuver and their strategic autonomy to the greatest extent possible, largely in order to diversify their relations, even though the US remains their security and defense partner, while their economic dealings are more Asian oriented.
And how important is energy today playing a part in all these relations? We've got the Russia war in Ukraine, which has triggered a change in flows, but oil is still flowing. Prices are more or less moderate now, under control. How much concern do you think these geopolitical changes are having to producers like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, and indeed to consumers like China? And of course, the US now as an independent, energy producer, right? I mean, that's another reason for the change in dynamic in the relationship. They don't really need Middle Eastern oil and gas as they used to. But how much of a weight does energy play in Saudi or GCC thinking today versus other economic opportunity, other geopolitical priorities?
So energy is central. It is really energy that makes Saudi Arabia arguably a middle power, for example. It's its ability to affect global oil markets and its ability to play the role of swing producer traditionally and so on. And it is from energy that it primarily derives its global geopolitical importance, is able to also extract, obviously, large sums of money, so really accumulate a strong financial capital that also allows it to intervene as a source of bailout aid, for example, within its own region. And also, of course, it's then that money that allows it to become a connectivity power, right, along with the UAE, and to play a very large outsized role in terms of global transportation and logistics and so on. But I think energy is a central consideration, and it's partly why the US-Saudi relations have become fairly tense. I think the Saudis have a clear understanding that the US is trying to rewrite the rules of the global energy markets, partly by imposing an oil price cap along with the Europeans and the G7. And so really an attempt by oil consumers to dictate oil prices, which is not the way it has traditionally been. Talk of reintroducing the NOPEC legislation in the U.S. Senate that takes aim at OPEC and under U.S. antitrust legislation, and also the U.S.'s sale of strategic petroleum reserves last year, I think, was also seen as an attempt at artificially depressing global oil prices. So I think the Saudis view the U.S.'s recent measures and steps as really an attempt at rewriting the rules of the global oil market, and therefore as a strategic risk for Saudi Arabia, whose global importance, but also whose economy relies on energy and trade. At the same time, the Saudis and the Emiratis have to be very clear-eyed, and I think they are, about where long-term oil demand is going to come from. And if most of the projections seem to suggest that it's going to be China and India to a large extent that are going to account for the long-term growth in global oil demand. And so I think the Saudis and Emiratis are already factoring this in. They're already pricing it in, so to speak, in their own foreign policies. By trying to lock in and maximize their market share for the long term. We've seen investments in refining and downstream oil in China and in India, for example, to lock in that long-term market share. And also really to strengthen the diplomatic and the political aspects of this relationship, and also to position themselves really as indispensable partners for China's geoeconomic ambitions in the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia trying to position itself as the gateway for China and the Arab world. This was the messaging that came out of the recent Saudi Arab Chinese summit, for example. So really positioning themselves as indispensable long-term energy and geoeconomic partners for growing Asian economies where they expect long-term oil demand growth to come from, and essentially really cementing those factors that will allow them to continue to play a long-term role as energy players. We have to keep in mind as well that what the Gulf states are doing in the renewable energy sector, so not just oil and gas, but also obviously solar, and also trying to position themselves in hydrogen, targeting Japan and Europe, also has geopolitical requirements for that to happen. And we've seen them invest a lot more significantly in the East Mediterranean zone, for example, in their relations with Turkey, Greece, Egypt, Cyprus, already trying to position themselves there as players in order to create the geopolitical infrastructure that will be necessary for them to serve as energy players with Europe.
Yes, and of course, as you said, so that's part two of their current energy strategy. But part one is to maximize those revenues until we reach, let's say, peak oil demand, and then the focus is going to turn to, renewables, cleaner energy, maybe petchems, etc. And they're making those. Now, you mentioned Cyprus and Egypt and the East Med, and of course, another country in the East Med is Israel, and that is one country that has been brought into the fold economically. Into the Gulf recently, not into bilateral relations with Saudi Arabia yet, but there are murmurings now that part of this whole geopolitical shifting plan is that Saudi is going to find a way also to make economic peace with Israel, right? Can you give us your viewpoint on how quickly that might happen? And let's bring in Turkey as well, because I know it's a different point, but let's bring in Erdogan's recent win, how he plays into the Gulf's pocket, if you like, and what influence he would have on the geopolitics of this region.
Wonderful. So I think on Israel, I'm somewhat of a skeptic that Saudi Arabia would move to establish diplomatic relations with Israel anytime soon, for several reasons. I think the most important of which is that U.S. elections are scheduled for next year, which means that we could be seeing another administration take office in the United States. And if that happens, I think the Saudis would not want to expand their bargaining leverage in striking sort of a big deal with the US now, their perhaps biggest point of bargaining power being establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, and really reaching a deal with the government that might no longer be in office in a year's time. And so I think, if anything, Saudi Arabia will want to wait and see what happens in next year's elections, and then try to strike a deal or a grand bargain, so to speak, and try and reset U.S.-Saudi relations with whoever wins the elections next year. So because of the U.S. elections, I doubt that the Saudis will move very quickly on the Israel file. The other issue is that the strategic and economic dividends of the Abraham Accords for the UAE and Bahrain are still not very clear. So Israeli trade with the UAE and Bahrain remains highly modest, especially with Bahrain. We haven't seen large flows of tourism. There's still a lot of domestic and popular resistance to widening cultural and business relations with Israel. And that's partly a reaction to Israel's own domestic political trajectory, which has taken sort of a hard turn to the right. And so I think because of those reasons, we've heard Saudi Arabia recently revive talk of the Arab Peace Initiative, right? And we've heard the Saudi Foreign Minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, at the Munich Security Conference, essentially state very clearly that a clear progression towards a two-state solution and a Palestinian state, essentially, would be a prerequisite for the normalization of Saudi-Israeli relations. So I think this Saudi messaging is indicative that we shouldn't be over-optimistic about, or over-optimistic, depends on how you see it, but shouldn't, I think, overestimate the speed with which Saudi Arabia may re-establish diplomatic relations with Israel. As far as Turkey is concerned, I think there is a degree of relief among the GCC states in seeing Erdogan come to win the elections and remain in power, if only because I think this is a point of uncertainty, potentially seeing a new Turkish government. It would not necessarily be very clear as to how the Turks would, in such a scenario, position themselves on relations with the Gulf states. Whereas I think we are now at a stage where Emirati and Saudi relations with Turkey are quite close. There is a growing defense industrial partnership. The Saudis are highly interested in, and the Emiratis as well, in Turkish UAVs, for example. And we've seen some cooperation very recently on that front. Saudi Arabia has recently, I think a few months ago, placed a $5 billion deposit into Turkey's central bank. The Emiratis have signed a credit default swap agreement with Turkey's central bank for about $5 billion. We're seeing talk of the Emiratis potentially setting up a $10 billion investment fund into Turkey. And so I think there's also a...
Just to pick up on that, just to not to interrupt you, but to go on about Turkey. But, so what difference do you think Erdogan will make this time round? Are we going to see a real change in his economic policies to try and sort of bring Turkey out of the mess that it's in domestically, economically, its monetary policy? And, there's been talk that, well, Turkey's very happy to have Saudi money and UAE money shoring up its reserves, etc. But it wants more than that. It wants physical investment into the country. It's not going to get that unless it assures investors that it's moving in the right direction on its sort of, I suppose, economic policy. So do you think we'll see a difference emerging, and can Turkey extract itself out of sort of the financial mess that it's in?
Well, I think in any case, that will certainly be a prerequisite for greater Gulf investments, because I think Turkey's currency risk, for example, and volatility of its currency is somewhat of an unappetizing, let's say, aspect of Turkey's economy. Yes, it means that Turkish investments become cheaper for the Gulf states to buy and acquire. And we've seen a degree of interest in the Gulf states potentially investing in Turkey's renewable energy sector, for example. But I think the volatility and the uncertainty that characterizes and underpins Turkey's economy is definitely going to be a barrier for greater GCC investments into Turkey. However, I think on the geopolitical side, there is a degree of convergence between the GCC states and Turkey at this present juncture, partly because both Turkey and the Gulf states see Iran's nuclear program as a source of concern. So the Turks are also unhappy about Iran potentially reaching, edging closer to weaponization. And on the other hand, I think they also converge on the way they've positioned themselves on the Russia-Ukraine war, and in really trying to balance, again, a very difficult set of relationships, both of which, where the US is a factor, a very important, obviously, defense and security factor, both for Turkey and the GCC states. So there is a degree of convergence, I think, geopolitically, that means that the Gulf states are probably going to try and help President Erdogan on the economic and financial front. But to see it really evolve beyond that into a very large scale set of GCC investments, I think that will really hinge on Turkey's economic performance, because I think we're now past the stage where the Gulf states are simply throwing money around for political gain. I think they have a very different attitude to their fiscal expenditure and to their spending as a whole, really, in general, where they're clearly exercising discipline and I think trying to really be strategic about, from a commercial perspective and economic perspective, about where they place their investments.
And of course, they're in a much stronger position, aren't they, than some other economies in the world, which are still struggling with. I mean, we have inflation here in the Gulf, but we have richer economies. We have simpler economies to run, and not so much debt, etc. So, how much do you think that is factoring in to thinking in the Middle East at the moment? The whole Fed policy, the interest rate rises, the impact that's having, of course, on economic sentiment globally. The debt situation is massive, and particularly it not only hits countries like the US in terms of it's accumulating more and more, but more so, non-OECD countries in South Asia, etc. Which have dollar-denominated debt and are not doing well. So, how much of a concern do you think that is playing at the moment on economies here in the region, not just the Gulf? Let's move into South Asia as well. The inflation problem, the global debt issue, and do you see which countries are being impacted more, and how should they look to deal with this?
So I think it's clear that the oil exporting GCC states have been some of the key beneficiaries of the global energy crisis, if only because of the rise in energy prices and the revenues that have resulted from that. They've also haven't faced massive food inflation, partly because of the fact that they are a lot more diversified in their import sources, where they import food from. They're not as dependent, actually, as many of the other states in the region on Russia and Ukraine. And so, in a sense, they've clearly managed to accumulate massive windfalls because of the rise in energy prices. On the other hand, they're surrounded by a set of net oil importing states in the MENA region that are facing sort of the triple challenge of higher expenditure and indebtedness due to COVID-19, with obviously states wanting to provide a basic safety net for their populations, rising energy prices, which already is a massive portion of their import bills, and of course rising food prices as well. So in a sense, really a triple crisis that is adversely affecting many of the big states in the MENA region within the broader periphery. And what has happened is that this has placed a massive demand on what here at the IISS we refer to as Gulf bailout diplomacy. And this is one of the big projects that we're currently working on, looking at the role of the Gulf states as lenders of last resort, as providers of bailout aid, coming in with massive amounts, placing them as central bank deposits in order to stabilize currencies, or as general budget support. And so we've seen a massive demand on Gulf bailout aid from Egypt, from Pakistan, from Sudan, from countries in the region, net oil importing countries that are facing unsustainable debt, essentially, and that are now all but relying on Gulf aid to bail them out and to prevent them from going completely bankrupt. And of course, the Gulf states have been fairly selective. They haven't, for example, intervened in Lebanon, for example, and they haven't disbursed aid in Sudan either, post the 2019 coup. So they've been fairly selective in their engagements, prioritizing Egypt and Pakistan, who have been the two biggest recipients of Gulf bailout aid over the past 2 years. But I think if the situation continues to deteriorate, and if these large economies are still unable to turn themselves around, we've already seen indications that the Gulf states' appetite for sort of untied, unrestricted bailouts has already decreased. We've heard the Qatari finance minister say this at the Qatar Economic Forum, and we've heard the Saudi finance minister Al-Jad'an make the same statement at Davos.
Yes, and as you said, I mean, they want to deal with at least countries who have stable governments, and Lebanon and Sudan certainly don't have that. Just before we run out of time, we have already run out of time, Hasan, but we'll keep going for another couple of minutes. I wanted to get your point of view on China and sort of the projections for its economy going forward, in terms of, obviously, as an energy consumer, that has a massive impact on what will happen to energy prices in the immediate term and perhaps medium term as well. A lot of balanced opinions these days on, well, China's had a fairly good recovery so far this year, and we should stop expecting it to go back to what it was doing, pre-COVID. And yet there's some skepticism as to how much its GDP will perform in the second half of this year. One reason being that it relies obviously a lot on demand from elsewhere for its exports, but also domestic policy, economic policy is a little bit volatile. What's your take on where we see Chinese growth, the range of this year and into 24-25?
So I'm really not the best place to comment on China's economic performance, but I think at least in the way that this potentially impacts the Gulf states and the Gulf region, is that obviously Chinese economic growth, as you know, is a key driver of global energy demand. And that obviously has a direct impact on the Gulf states and on their own economic well-being. China is not the only economy that's slowing down. India is another economy that has slowed down significantly, and we're seeing talk even by senior, former Indian economic policy officials talking about a return sort of to the pre-1991 liberalization sort of era rates of growth, right? And so I think in general, the Gulf states are right to be concerned that a slowdown in Asian economic growth, especially India and China, that are already their biggest consumers of oil and gas, and that are their big economic and trading partners for these states, is obviously very, very worrying. But I think the Gulf states are already putting in place the diplomatic and political architecture for wider economic relations with other regions of the world that might end up growing at a faster pace. So we've seen a very high degree of interest from the Gulf states in Africa, for example, and in building bridges with Africa, stabilizing the East African shore of the Red Sea, stabilizing the Red Sea region, also prioritizing relations with Southeast Asia, which is also expected to be an important source of global economic growth. And so in a sense, I think the Gulf states are really moving in a fairly agile and dexterous manner in trying to position themselves as connectivity hubs, creating the political and diplomatic infrastructure that they will need to create better economic connectivity with regions where they expect economic growth to be coming from in the future. So they're already not only hedging against their overdependence on the US and the West by engaging China and India and others, but they're already sort of hedging against a potential slowdown in China and India by engaging other regions within their broad periphery.
Well, that's really interesting, particularly your point about India, because what I hear is that India is actually got a more positive trajectory going forward, that it's unstoppable, the size of its economy, it's a democracy, it can, but very interesting to see that the Gulf also is not just hedging its bets on those two huge economies east of here. Dr. Hasan, Research Fellow for Middle East Policy at IISS. We have run out of time. It's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for your insight on the regional geopolitics and how that ripples both East and West. Thanks so much for joining us today on Halftime Talk.